All right. My name is Mike Fonseca. I'm president of the First Flight Society in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. We're going to be talking with the Wright family today. We've got Amanda Wright Lane and Stephen Wright, who are the I guess the best way to put it is it's great
Great
grand
niece and nephew.
nephew. Okay. And luckily, it's not the whole cousin thing where it's second cousin twice removed. So that's good. Welcome and
Thank you.
welcome to the celebration. It's the 117th anniversary. It's December 17th. And we all know that that date in 1903 was very important. Let me just start by asking each of you what your roles in giving out the history of the Wright brothers is nowadays. Let me start with Amanda.
Well, our role actually began about 20 years ago when my dad passed away. He was a great nephew of Orville and Wilbur Wright, and he was fortunate enough to live his first 26 years in the company of Uncle Orv. Wilbur, of course, died in 1912. And Dad was born in 22, and Uncle Orv died in 1948. So he really knew him, and for many years he was our family spokesperson. And when he was dying, Steve and I realized that it was beginning the build up to the 2003 celebration, the 100th anniversary of flight, and we knew we'd be called upon to fill in our dad's shoes a bit through the celebration. So I think that's when we first really got it was drinking out of a fire hose at first, I think, and speaking to the public. I don't know if Steve feels the same way. We tried to read all the books in my dad's library, which were quite a few, and school ourselves very quickly because we heard many stories about Uncle Orv and Uncle Will at the dinner table of our great aunts and uncles. His direct nephews, his older brother's children, Lauren Wright, his four children were in our lives for most of our young life. So his direct nieces and nephews, and they told stories when we got together on Sunday night. So it was Uncle Orv this and Uncle Will that, and I remember when he blah, blah, blah. But I don't know that Steve and I really knew the Wright brothers. I don't know that we knew, or at least I didn't know, I didn't understand enough about their technical achievement. I'm still not sure I completely do, but I think I can tell most audiences about it in a way that they can understand it like me, not an aerospace engineer.
All right, and Stephen?
Well, I would just echo what Amanda just said. We began this about 20 years ago with really very little experience doing public speaking or making appearances and that sort of thing. And really, regretting that we hadn't listened a little more closely when our great aunts and uncles told stories because they were just sort of in the background. We were kids at the time, and I don't think that history really hits you until you become an adult and you find out how important Wilbur and Orville Wright's contribution was to the history of mankind. And so, we had to come up to speed rather quickly. At the time, I was still working, and Amanda really shouldered most of the responsibilities. It was incredible how many groups asked you to come and speak and just, perform various functions for them in this role. And I simply wasn't able to do it. I had to go to work every day. And Amanda has shouldered probably more responsibility than she actually needed to, and has really stepped up over the last 20 years to assume a role of leadership on various boards, committees, advisory councils, and that sort of thing. So it's a real reward to go out and speak to people it's a lot of work to prepare because we don't know this history just off the cuff. We have to refer back to books just like anyone else would, and we have to confer with the experts as well. And I don't always get it right. A lot of times, when I'm speaking in front of professional historians who, in some cases, will kind of raise a hand tentatively and correct me on dates and circumstances and that sort of thing. So. I think we're still learning, and we're still pretty much amateurs at it. The professionals are out there, and they do a very good job of it, and we're still learning from them. But it's been a great journey. It's been a lot of fun.
It has been a lot of fun. I was going to say one thing. I think, Steve, even if we were, I guess we were in our young teens, actually, when we were still having those dinner parties with our aunts and uncles. I'm not sure I'm not sure how old I would have been before I really realized what they were telling us, because it was so matter of fact.
Mm-hmm.
They talked about Uncle Lord was a fussy dresser. They talked about that Uncle Will was the best of the two for babysitting. I mean,
Right.
I would have ever delve into that more with me, because it was just they really talked about them as uncles, and I guess that was my point, that they were family members we heard about.
Right, and Mike, yeah, a lot of the conversation was about just Wilbur and Orville as uncles, not as the inventors of powered flight. It was so matter of fact that it just became a little bit of the background when we were kids to hear these stories.
Yeah, so you just took it for granted because it was like, oh, these are those, probably even to the point where it's like, oh, do I have to hear about those guys again?
Well, we definitely got the picture that they were probably among the best uncles you could ever wish to have. They were really great with their nieces and nephews. They spent a lot of time with them, Orville in particular, and they took great joy in entertaining their nieces and nephews and challenging them and playing jokes on them and all the kinds of things that you would wish an aunt or uncle to do with you when you're a child. They definitely excelled at that, as well as their role as engineers.
And just to clarify some things, you all are descended from Lauren, right? Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So what's funny is a lot of the world, when you say, how many Wright brothers were there? They say 2. And it's like, nope, try again.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things that's interesting, is to kind of try and put together a little bit of a family tree so that people understand how, because I know that most people are like, well, wait a minute, neither one of them had kids, so how are these people related? So, that's one of those things I always like to explain, because, some people know that they had a sister, and especially because she was very instrumental in their work. But I think it's important to help explain the whole Wright brothers family history.
Our great grandfather Lauren was sort of in the background while all this history was unfolding. He worked pretty closely with Wilbur and Orville throughout his life, and they held him in high esteem. They sought his advice, and he helped them whenever he could with various projects. He was even asked to go spy at one point on Glenn Curtis in 1914, I believe it was. And Lauren was always there, and you just never heard mention of his name, but he was always there to help Wilbur and Orville.
I think if you read too, I think about Uncle Will was the middle child. There were actually seven children born to Susan and Milton Wright. A set of twins died, so there were 5 surviving children: Rushlin, Lauren, Wilbur, Orville, Catherine. Uncle Will was in the middle. And again, I'll refer to a book. I remember reading Tom Crouch's book, that Will learned to play both sides. When he wanted to run around with the bigger kids, he did. And when he wanted to run around with the younger kids, with Catherine and Uncle Lord, he did. And he sometimes made their lives miserable, teasing them, etc. And it's interesting, in Wright family lore, Roosh, the oldest son, was thought to be the one that was the most odd, eccentric, or not eccentric, but I should say the black sheep, because as a young man, he eventually left Dayton with his family to find a better way to earn a living. And everyone was so shocked by that. They weren't shocked about any table talk about inventing an airplane, but they were shocked that Rouge walked to the beat of a different drummer. And so he was the one that was more thought of, oh, a little bit more the one that was not as close in the family fold.
Okay. Well, and that kind of brings me, what was your father's name?
Wilkinson, George Wilkinson Wright. Wick,
Okay.
he was known.
Wick. And so he was kind of, I guess he was the keeper of the flame till you all came and took the torch.
Yeah.
Had you thought about any of that before he passed away, or it was a matter of, oh my gosh, it's now we got to do something?
I don't think I really gave it a thought. You expect people to last forever. Prior to our father taking up that role, he probably did that for 10 or 15 years. Our great aunt Ivanette was the one who went out and did the public speaking and attended ceremonies and that sort of thing in a big way. And she had done that ever since, actually, during the time Orville was still alive, when his health wasn't that good and when he just didn't want to go to a ceremony, she would usually go in his place. So she had done that for 40 or 50 years. And our father sort of took that over when she became, unable to do those things anymore. So, yeah, that was his role. Each generation of our family, there has been someone who has sort of stepped up to take the role as a spokesperson.
I think Dad, like us, he was in attendance when the Wright Brothers National Memorial was dedicated. He was, I think he would have been 10 years old. Was it 1932, I believe?
1932, yes.
And so he tells us great stories about that, but they're the stories through a 10-year-old's eyes of his older brother. He had an older brother, Milton. They took a journey that was by train and by boat to get to the ceremony. Uncle Milt, his older brother, was leaning over the side of the boat. I'm afraid I'm going to be sick. I'm afraid I'm going to be sick. And of course he got sick. And those are the kind of stories. Dad told us the 10-year-old stories. He remembers standing under the tent flap in front of the memorial. It was, of course, a North Carolina day, very windy, very cold, and one of the tent flaps became unattached, untied, and he thought the whole tent would be lifted, and he was waiting for it to lift like a hot air balloon and float away. So those are the kinds of things he remembers. But I believe that day Amelia Earhart was there. There was just some very famous, the creme de la creme of the aeronautical world at that time. And Dad he knew about it in later years. He understood who he was there, but he thought about the boy things. My brother threw up on the way down there, and our tent almost blew away with us in it. So it's funny.
But see,
he would go back and if he could have asked some good questions about that day.
Oh, see, that's what I love. See, this is what's great about talking to you too, is hearing those stories. I personally have read McCullough's book and Tom Crouch's books and any number of things about the Wright brothers, but you don't find out a lot of those little things, the family stories, and you don't hear. Well, they concentrate on leading up to the flight and the flight. So to me, it's always interesting to hear about, well, what happened after that, and I personally am also very interested in the family and how the family saw it and what they thought. So, like, for instance, I have a feeling that most people will think, oh, well, they were brought up with the Wright brothers the whole time, and so they've been fanatics about this since they were kids, and we've already seen that is not the case. So I know that one of the big things that you all have done is the Wright Brothers Foundation, Family Foundation. Is that something that your father started, or you two started, or all three of you together, or a little explanation on that?
Our father started it, I believe, in 1992.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of a funny story, actually. He was visiting our sister in San Francisco, who was married to an attorney, and he got a call from an agency, an advertising agency, who wanted to represent, who was representing a client, and they had asked to use the Wright brothers images or something to do with the Wright brothers in an advertising campaign. And my father said, we've never really charged anybody anything to do that. You feel free to do that. My sister's brother overheard that conversation, and he said, wait a minute. You could be making money and putting it to some good use if you if you did this and that, if you formed this a foundation, a nonprofit. So my dad took that to heart, and he came back to Dayton and did just that, and formed this small family foundation, and began collecting fees for use of the Wright brothers images, and we also have since trademarked some phrases as well. So the royalties paid to us for the use of the Wright brothers name in advertising and various causes helps us to fund causes that we think are important. And the Wright Brothers Family Foundation, our mission is to support organizations that are scholarly in nature, that talk about aviation history and preserve aviation artifacts and things of that nature. That's what we try to do with those monies earned.
And so, who are some of the organizations that you all are close to, or work with, or belong to, dealing with the Wright brothers and aviation in general? I know with Amanda, like if I go online, she's been awarded or been involved with everything you can think of. But I would like if you guys could talk about that a little bit.
Probably a few organizations that are the most important to us. For instance, we're currently paying a grant to the National Air and Space Museum for improvement to the display. They're remodeling that whole museum. We're helping them somewhat with financing that project. One of our most one of the causes that's most dear to us is the archive at Wright State University that houses a lot of the Wright brothers papers. It's it's probably the second largest collection of Wright brothers documents and memorabilia in the world, next to what is in the Library of Congress, maybe just as big actually. And we're also one of our biggest concerns is building an endowment for Hawthorne Hill, which was Wilbur and Orville Wright's sort of dream house that they built in 1912. That house currently is owned by Dayton History, which is our local private nonprofit historical society. They do a very good job of running and managing the house, but it does not have what you would call a bank account for the future. And we would like to build enough funds in that account in order to keep the house sustained into perpetuity. Because we realize that we are going to pass away at some point, and this responsibility will either have to go on to our children, or it's going to have to be taken up by some other entity. And we don't want this to be a burden on our children in their lives, and we would rather have the house well taken care of, and that's another goal of ours. I don't know, Amanda, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I wanted to add that, Mike, you're invited to come visit sometime.
Oh,
Take you through Hawthorne Hill, have some libations on the side porch, and it's really I think you get a sense of the second part of the brothers' lives, beyond first flight, beyond 1910, beyond the sale of the Flyers, beyond the sale of their business eventually, et cetera. It's just it's a whole different story, and for us, from our perspective, it's the place my dad knew. That was Uncle Laura's home, and that's where this time of year I think about Christmas. They've spent all major holidays with Uncle Orv and Aunt Catherine at his house. All the Laurens, all the whole family did. So it's special. So we come see it sometime.
Oh no, absolutely. I have a little bit of a tie to Ohio. My father lived there for many years in Mansfield, which
Oh
I
gosh.
imagine you've heard of because I know you're. And I've also been to Dayton more times than I can count to the Air Force Museum. That was
Yeah.
one of his favorite places to go, and of course, I was love to go with him to that. In fact, it's my father who gave me my love of aviation. So, and I've been, for lack of a better term, a Wright brothers nerd since I was a kid.
Yay.
So,
You can imagine there are so many organizations here in town that all have sort of a little niche that they support in terms of the Wright brothers history. We've got the National Park Service. We have Dayton History, as I mentioned. We have a group called Wright Bee Flyer that fly a look-alike Wright airplane. You can actually take a ride in it when we're not under the command of a pandemic. Various other little groups that do their part to preserve the Wright brothers' history, and we try to help them out with little projects that they have as much as we can.
Mhm. Big stuff and little stuff. They're all
Sure.
important. All the things are important.
yeah, well, even down here in the Outer Banks, every time everything you look at is first flight this and first flight that. You know, they may not actually have anything to do with that, but you can tell the Outer Banks is very proud of their association with the Wright brothers.
Yes, it is.
Another question that came up, I know you were talking about how you didn't want this to be a burden on your children. Do your children have any interest in any of this? Do they participate, or are they kind of like, well, you guys do that and we'll not worry about it?
We were at the same point that they are in their lives at one point too, and when you're raising children and trying to advance in a career and things of that nature, you just don't have time, and that's where they're all at right now. Maybe when they get closer to our age, they'll take a greater interest in it, but at this point, it's just unclear, and it's pretty well. I think it's kind of well known that the further away you get in terms of generations from that history, the less interest there might be. So we're kind of preparing ourselves for that outcome possibly. I'm the last one left in Dayton, for instance. Amanda lives 70 miles away in Columbus, so I'm really the only member of the Wright family, and there aren't very many of us that still actually lives in the town where the Wright brothers lived. So I have a daughter in Cincinnati and a son in Columbus, and we're just scattered all over the country, and it's a little harder to be close to it when you're not close to it.
Close to it. Physically close to it.
Yeah.
True. It's normal, Mike. I think they don't think about it, but I think someday they'll be forced to think about it because I think they will still be sought out a bit. Maybe not, as Steve says, as history marches on. I think sometimes the Wright brothers story gets smaller in the history books, even though I do think it's a story that was so completely world changing. It just made everything we did take a huge left turn and go in another direction. It's just amazing. I was thinking this week about how stories that you can't go a week without a story of aviation in the news. Chuck Yeager dying this week, General McGee's big birthday. All these things are. It's around us all the time, and as long as it is, I fear they'll still be, if they want to, they'll still be sought out and.
I'm confident too that the Wright brothers are still going to be very much in the forefront here in Dayton as well, because we're the home of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is one of the most important Air Force bases that we have. It's the center for all the Air Force research. So in a sense, what the Wright brothers started has never left Dayton. All of the it was just I was just reading an article in the paper the other day, and the writer of that article made the same remark that I've made many times. When you the base that gets all the publicity with regards to advances in flight, of course, is in California, because that's where all the test flying is done. But a lot of these systems and technologies that they're testing have a home here in Dayton, Ohio. That's where they're developed. and that's where they're procured. And then they're later taken to Edwards Air Force Base to be flight tested. So Dayton is still very much a part of aviation, and I think as long as that is going on, the Wright brothers aren't going to be forgotten here.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, all I was going to say is on that note, it seems like they come to the forefront every once in a while just because of large events. So, for instance, the centennial flight that we've talked about in 2003, and even David McCullough's book coming out and being a national sensation, really, I think has kind of brought it back up. So I don't think it's going away anytime soon. The interest in the Wright brothers, and one of the things that we're trying to do is make sure that the kids of the world know about the Wright brothers and their story and how important it is. It's one of those things where people, for lack of a better term, take it for granted because, airplanes, especially with kids, airplanes have been around forever. And it's amazing how it hits every part of our lives.
Right. Our father's cousin made the remark that about once a generation, somebody writes a new book about the Wright brothers and interest is renewed. And I think that's true. It started with Fred Kelly's book and then Tom Crouch's book, The Bishop's Boys, and Harry Combs' book in 2003, and just recently with McCullough's book. So that interest is constantly being churned back to the surface, and it might lie low for a little while, but eventually somebody's going to take an interest in it and come back and write a new slant on the story. So
just yesterday or the day before, there's some technology being developed around flying cars. We've all heard about that a bit. But two folks that are now working on it, a former astronaut and a former NASA Glenn president or CEO of NASA Glenn, they filmed an interview on Huffman Prairie this week to talk about that. And so it's funny how so many things continue to circle back to that. It's so incredibly interesting. And I think, I don't know if Steve would say the same thing or not. After the centennial flight, we thought things would quiet down a bit, but we were contacted by Europe that Europeans have such reverence for First Flight and for Wilbur Wright. Wilbur's the only brother they actually really got to know. But how important it is to other countries, around the world, immensely. You say Wright brothers in any language, and they know it. So for me, that has been so eye-opening to understand that maybe even more so than Americans, how the world reveres what they did.
Yeah, I actually have it set, as my role as president of First Flight Society. I've got a Google search to give me alerts whenever the Wright brothers are mentioned, and it's literally every day. Sometimes it's just an article where they say it's a Wright brothers moment or something like that, but it's amazing how many times they're referenced in a story. Sometimes actually about them, but sometimes it's just the fact of, these are the guys who invented the powered airplane. So yeah, it's one of those things where we had the centennial flight in 2003. It was a huge deal, 5-day celebration. And I was actually there with my father. And because I said, I can't miss this. And North Carolina, it's so close. So I actually begged off work so that I could go. And they made such a great big deal of it. But the thing about it is the First Flight Society honors them every year. Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. So my thing is, the 100th anniversary is important, but to be honest, the way we look at it is every anniversary is important. So even though this is the 117th, to us, it's as big a deal as the 100th was or the 75th. So we're kind of going to go ahead with that view that, every December 17th is important. So we'll see how that goes.
Well, each year on the 17th, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base has a small ceremony. We have a wreath laying out at the Wright Brothers Memorial. They're continuing with that this year too. We're still going to do it. So you're not the only ones who think that way. And thank you for that.
No, that's good. And the other thing I was going to say is, are you very familiar with the Jamesons, who are part of your family? I guess your cousins.
Yeah.
Paul Jameson is on our board, and we also have a lot of contact with John and Duncan. So I just didn't know if you all talk much, or if there is a North Carolina, Virginia, Ohio divide.
No.
We don't see them much personally, but I think their story has been pretty much the same as ours. That just in recent years, their interest in the Wrights has really increased, and they've had to, I think, do a lot more homework, just like we have too. So yeah, they've really come to the forefront as well. So
the Jameson family, of the four Laurens that were born to Lauren, Ivanette, Milton, Horace, and Leontine. Leontine, who became Leontine Wright Jameson, she was the only one that was whisked away to Chicago. So we didn't get a chance to really grow up with those cousins, whereas Horace's family, Milton's family, and Ivanette's family were in the Dayton area. So, but I think, yeah, wherever they are around the nation, I think people find them and seek out that information and those stories, and they have different perspective too, and different stories than we do, which is also really interesting. We really actually should compile family stories.
Yeah, actually, talking to you today, that's something I was thinking about. Is I don't think that's. I mean, some of them have been covered in books, but it seems like just even being able to pass down stories you heard at the dinner table, from all members of the family would make for a very interesting book. Might be something we have to talk about after this.
There you
go. I think we've kind of covered, my big thing was I wanted to introduce you all to our audience. And I appreciate all the input and the support that we've gotten from the Wright family. And we really kind of wanted to just make sure everybody knew about you and your stories and the stories you're trying to tell. Actually, you know what? Before I go, I wanted to say, can you talk a little bit about some of the things you've got going on behind you, both of you, Amanda and Stephen? Because obviously there's an Orville Wright photo right there, and you've got some other things.
Yep. Well, I got this picture out today of Uncle Orv. Sorry, because of my windows in my room. He's
we can see it.
The biggest grin ever. And let's see if I can get it in there.
Tilted down. Tilted down. There you go.
There you go.
So there's a big grin, and there's snow on his lapel. And a very famous photographer from Dayton took some early flights of the Wright brothers' work, and he captured this photo of Uncle Orv one day that I just love, because this is the guy who is not in the history books. This is the guy Steve and I heard about around the dining room table, the one that played pranks, the one that liked to make people sweat in his home. This is the person I wanted to know, and you can see this in his devilish grin. And another thing I brought out today, was a picture of his only child. This is Scipio.
Oh, yes.
Scipio was Uncle Orv's Saint Bernard. It came to live with Uncle Orv as a puppy, which was also an interesting story. But I think Scipio was 125 pounds. Steve, do you remember? Have you got a picture of him there?
He was a big dog.
Scipio ran Hawthorne Hill. He helped himself to sitting on all the beautiful velvet settees. He vacationed with Uncle Orv in Georgian Bay when Uncle Orv, right after Wilbur's death, Uncle Orv was pretty down in the mouth, and Aunt Catherine had a teaching friend that said, "Have you guys ever been to Georgian Bay, been to Canada?" And So she's took Uncle Orv up there, and that began a love affair of that family, of that area of Canada. It was just beautiful. But anyway, Scipio, there's a wonderful set of pictures of Scipio in a canoe with Uncle Orv. The next picture is the canoe capsized. The next picture is Scipio's head coming out of the water, and then the next picture is Uncle Orv's head coming out of the water. So these are just some of the, big stories we grew up with, and so I think a lot about. I just think a lot about who they were as men this time of year, because we celebrate their genius, but they grew up in a family that was so positive and forward thinking, and as I said before, for their sons to talk around the dining room table about their work on a flying machine, no one batted an eye. They just asked good questions like you're asking today, Mike. So that I think about them as people usually on this anniversary. So that's what I brought to share. Oh, and one tiny other thing. This is a tiny, tiny, tiny little Wright flyer that for me symbolizes someone handed this to me in a crowd in Europe when we went to France for the celebration of Wilbur's flights there in 1908. We went in 2008, Steve and I. They made a huge deal of that anniversary. And so it reminds me of the artists that Uncle Will encountered when he was there, and that someone took the time to make this tiny thing.
Those were place settings. Remember that? Those were place settings. I have one of those too.
Yeah.
They made
so,
it.
They sought us out to hand us this and say that they cared about that history. So I think about those things too.
Oh, that's wonderful.
He's got stuff going on behind him.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah. Well, a lot of what I have behind me are a couple of cartoons that were done during that time period. Of course, prior to their flight, as you can imagine, Wilbur and Orville were made a lot of fun of. You were viewed as being crazy, and it was actually if you were experimenting with the possibility of human flight in those days, a lot of people wanted to keep it a secret because they didn't want people to view them as being, not all there.
Right.
And as a result, editorial cartoonists made a lot of fun of them. There's one here of Wilbur and Orville depicted as crows sitting on the parapets of Fort Myer, Virginia, and the Army guy is trying to get them to go. He's waving his hat at them and saying "shoo" because they were so persistent at trying to sell their machine to the federal government, and the federal government was just turning a deaf ear to them. So a lot of just interesting things were created as a result of that. And Orville had a collection of all the cartoons that he could find that made fun of them because he was obviously the one that got the last laugh. He and Wilbur both got that. But Amanda was talking about photos of Wilbur and Orville where you seldom see them smiling, and I'm the same way. There are very few rare photos of them where they have big smiles, and I have one here of Wilbur that was taken, I believe, when he was in France, and he's sitting in a chair, and it's a profile, which I love. I think we don't shoot enough profiles these days of people, but it really shows his long nose and his forehead and his great grin, and you can see he had huge dimples on the side of his face, and when he did smile, it was very broad and very warm. And he was very self-conscious of it because he damaged his teeth in an accident when he was a young man and didn't smile very often. And also in those days, people it just wasn't the style to smile for a photograph, but occasionally a photographer would catch them, off guard, and they would be smiling very broadly. And that was true particularly with a couple of other images of Wilbur when he was in France. His photo was taken when he was greeting Charlie Taylor, who came over to help him for the first time. He had a huge, broad smile on his face, and he's given Charlie Taylor a pat on the shoulder, I think. And there's another one that's I believe the situation was that he was standing for a formal portrait in a row of poplar trees along a road in Le Mans, possibly at the horse racing track at Hunandere where he had flown, and a second photo where he's, I think, walking away from that photo session, and he's got a huge broad smile on his face. And somebody thought to snap a photo. It might have been the same photographer at that point, but we don't see them smiling often, and this is really the image that we should have of them. They're not the sober individuals that you often see in photos. They were very fun-loving, great guys to be around, aside from their great accomplishment.
No, see, that's great to hear because it's like you said, most of the photos here are these guys with their suits and their hats, and they're very serious looking. And so it's great to hear about them as people and as uncles. So I love hearing this, and I'm sure that some of the people watching will also be surprised and glad to hear that.
Sure. Here's another image that's you probably don't see very commonly. In 1916, Orville, along with a whole entourage of family members and his housekeeper, Carrie Grumbaugh, and her husband, took a vacation to Canada. Orville's health had not been good in recent years, and so he was persuaded by Catherine to go up to Georgian Bay and just spend some time decompressing up there. And they rented a house on a little island. Georgian Bay is dotted with thousands of little granite islands where people have cottages, and they had rented a cottage on an island and stayed there for, I believe, several weeks. There was going to be a railroad strike, so they had to cut their vacation a little short in order to get back to Dayton easily. And by the time they'd left, Orville had purchased his own island up there, and that's where he would really choose to spend every moment he could for the next 20 years or so. He and Catherine would go up there and spend time on Lambert Island. So this is a photo taken from the top of the island up where Orville's house was. It sat on the top of a rock. It was maybe 30 or 40 feet off of the water. And there's a little sailboat down here. The island was horseshoe shaped and had this beautiful little bay in it. And that, I believe, is our Uncle Horace, our Uncle Bus, Orville's nephew, in a sailboat down there making his way around the island.
Wow, that looks beautiful.
Yeah, it still is. To this day, it's beautiful.
Pristine.
Sure.
Show and tell.
Yeah.
No, I personally love show and tell, and I'm guessing some of the people watching this also love show and tell. So, and then right behind your head up high is what?
The propeller.
We've got a propeller here too. That's a propeller from a late model Wright plane. Don't hold me to this. I believe it was a Wright Model H. It was one of the last airplanes that the Wright company ever built. And you can see it's a much larger, more robust propeller than you would see on the 1903 machine or any of those later machines. Yeah, that sat in our basement the whole time we were children, and it was kind of in bad shape. And some volunteers, when they found out about it, offered to restore it. So it's been brought back to its original splendor. So it's quite a neat piece.
No, I also find that interesting because the man that we're honoring today, inducting into the Paul E. Garber Shrine, is Frank Caldwell, who was an expert on propellers and invented the hydromatic propeller that was very important in World War II. And so we're probably having more discussions about propellers today than most people want, but to be honest, it's pretty fascinating. And we've even talked with an expert from the Smithsonian, Dr. Kinney, about propellers and about Frank Caldwell and about the Wright brothers.
Well, we've often been told, and I guess this is true, that the Wrights invented propeller theory, and even to this day, the best propellers we have are maybe 10% more efficient than the ones that they were able to hand carve. So it's a tribute to them and their work, I think, to understand that we haven't really advanced all that much in propeller design from where they started. So this propeller also is kind of fun. Somebody every once in a while will take an interest in it when they visit our house, and I take it down from the wall and I hand it to them with both hands because I want them to feel how light that thing is. I think it's probably a good 7 feet long, maybe 7.5 feet long, and it maybe weighs 10, 15 pounds. It's just
Oh,
it's an amazing piece of engineering, all made out of spruce.
wow. Did you have something else you wanted to add, Amanda?
I was just gonna, we brought the Outer Banks with us today too, because, you know, you're quite familiar with this photo, I'm sure.
Very familiar.
But this one says to George and Susie, that those are our parents. My dad preferred to be called Wick, so maybe Uncle Orr put George just to make him crazy. To George and Susie, with every good wish, Uncle Orr, December 17th, 1947, which is just a month really before he dies. He dies I think in the end of January of 48. So in the next month, Uncle Orr was gone. But I also I keep there's a small business card of his here that has Mr. Orville Wright, but he's crossed it out and written Uncle Orr, which I love. So this was when you were talking about propellers, and I think about this day, I think that had to be one of the absolute turning point, most important pieces of the technology that they figured out was the propeller.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. Everybody before that had been basing it on ships' screws, and every time I read their story, you know, the things they started going with what everybody else was using, and then they started to realize how much of it was wrong, and they just said, "All right, we got to figure out what it really is," and that's amazing to me because it's so many little things that had to come together to be able to get this to work, and that these two guys just, you know, they built on what everybody else had done, but then corrected it, and you know, their genius amazes me every day.
Yeah.
Their ability to break down a really complex problem and make simple statements about it that would get them on track to solve the problem, I think was really pretty brilliant. And when you talk about the propeller, that was probably one of the hardest problems they had to crack, because you had to envision something that was constantly moving through a moving medium, never held still. And of course, in any kind of experiment, you want to find a constant a control. And you couldn't envision a control of a propeller, and they were able to just theorize that it was probably just a wing traveling in a circle, and go from there. And from that, they progressed the theory.
Wow.
Pretty neat.
Yep, amazing. Well, I want to thank you both for your time today. We really appreciate it. I feel like this was very informative, and now more people have heard your stories, and I'm hoping that we'll also talk to you later. Go into, I guarantee we could talk for hours and hours. So if you all are inclined, we'll talk later, and you know, it doesn't have to be the 17th for us to produce a video and put it up and share it with everybody. So thanks very much for your time. I really, really appreciate it.
Yep. Merry Christmas and happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Merry Christmas.